On the 12th of February this year, I received an email from the university which put my life into complete disarray. Now let me show you what that email is. Now as you can see, the email said that I was to start remote teaching on the 17th of February, which was just a few days away. And I was totally unprepared for that. So I went online to look for help, and then very quickly I found a plethora of articles about how to conduct remote teaching, some of which seemed to be written by people who had not done any remote teaching themselves before. And all of a sudden, there was a surge of online courses on remote teaching, like these ones. But the problem was, I didn't have time to sign up for these online courses anymore because I was to start in just a few days. So at that moment, I realized that I had to explore remote teaching on my own. So at that time, my two biggest concerns regarding remote teaching were, firstly, how to build up the relationship between me and the students, and also between the students themselves. And then secondly, how to stay united with my students in terms of teaching and learning. So at that time, for one of the courses that I was teaching, I had met the students 2 times face to face, and then for an upcoming course, I hadn't even met the students before. But for me, the dimension of relationship is important, because I'm sure most of you have heard of this quote by James Comer, that no significant learning occurs without a significant relationship. Now, I'm sure you're also aware of the importance of relationship building, and that you have also tried different strategies in building up the relationship between you and your students, and also between themselves. Now, a number of things that I myself have tried. So, for example, at the beginning of a course, then I would introduce myself with a short video. I would also invite the students to briefly introduce themselves using Flipgrid. Another strategy that I have tried is to invite the students to briefly describe themselves and then attach a photo of themselves to a deck of Google Slides. I would also check in with my students by writing short emails to them regularly. Now, I'm sure you also have a lot of experience in building and maintaining the relationship between you and your students during remote teaching. So in the remainder of this presentation, I'm going to focus on how to be remote, but at the same time stay united in terms of teaching and learning. So in the 8 months after February, I continued to explore different ways to engage my students during remote lessons. And now I'm going to share with you some of the strategies that I have tried in my virtual lessons. Now, today most teachers are familiar with tools for polling. I also use polling at the beginning of a lesson to warm up the class and also to collect students' ideas. And in my experience, this is a very, very easy but very effective way to engage the students at the beginning of a lesson. So for example, I would use Answer Garden to poll my students, all right, on a topic like this one. In the first part of a remote lesson, I also like to show students' work from the previous class. So for example, I use the app Seesaw for students to submit short tasks towards the end of each session. So in the first part of each new session, I will make a point of showing some of the students' work to the whole class so that they know that I have been following their work, that I'm interested in what they have been doing. Now, on top of showing the work that my students have done for me, I also make a point of enabling students to share their work with each other. So in my remote lessons, I also have group work, okay? And then I would also ask them to submit their group work to Padlet. And then when they're done, I would give them a little bit of time, right, to look at each other's work. And for me, this is a very, very effective way to build up this relationship between my students and to make them feel connected with each other. So even though they're not seeing each other face to face. Now, my online classes are rather long, right? Each will run for 2.5 hours. So in order to liven up the classes, all right, occasionally I will also conduct some competitions. And I, like a lot of teachers, I also use quizzes and also Kahoot. And even though my students are, well, most of them are teachers, they are adults, well, I can tell you that they also enjoy these online games and competitions with Kahoot and quizzes and so on. And just now I said my classes are rather long, 2.5 hours. So no matter how concentrated my students are, there are still chances that they might feel lost after some time. So my strategy is to show the learning progress visually using some apps. So one of the tools that I use to show learning progress visually is Loops Education. So at the beginning of a long session, I will show them this map, and then I will tell them, okay, all right, so this is the start, the first stop of our learning journey, where we will look at some multimodal writing done by students. And then later, our second stop is to look at some teachers' explorations and so on and so on. All right. So at the beginning of each session, I will show them the overall picture visually. And then at different intervals during the session, I will refer my students again to the overall map, and then I will show them, okay, now we are here, we are at the third stop, and so on, all right, so as to avoid my students losing their way. This is another app which I use to show the learning progress visually. It's called Sutori. And so each Sutori image is called Sutori timeline. So later I will show you how it works. Now another strategy that I use to engage my students is to use short learning paths once in a while in a long session. Now, what is a learning path like? Now, actually, if you're familiar with Google Forms, then you already know what a learning path is like. So with a Google form, you can design it in such a way that it has several parts. So let's say 3 parts or 4 parts, and then you can insert links to learning resources into each part. And then you can also insert quizzes into each part. So the students will complete the whole learning journey part by part. Now, other apps for creating learning paths that I have used are, for example, Classcraft, Symbaloo Learning Path, and also Go Conquer. So later I'm going to show you how Symbaloo and Go Conquer work. Now, in my classes, I always try to avoid doing extended lecturing, and instead I would use teacher-paced interactive lesson units every now and then. Now, what do I mean by teacher-paced interactive lesson units? Now, if you look at the names of these apps, then you will know what I mean. So apps like Nearpod, Pear Deck, Slido, GoFormative, and Perusall. Now, I call them interactive lesson units instead of interactive lessons because I don't use these tools for my entire 2.5-hour lecture. I only use these units for parts of each lecture. Now, to be honest, after my students have logged into Zoom, there is no way I can tell whether they are at the computer or not, or whether they're actually doing something else. So every now and then I would use these short interactive lesson units because, well, then I can tell who are actually joining my lessons, and my students know that I know who are joining my interaction lesson units and who are not. And of course, not to mention the fact that with these apps like Nearpod, Pear Deck, Slido, and so on and so on, so the students do not just listen, they have to respond as well. Now, my students are in-service teachers and pre-service teachers, and they are, well, adults. Do I use quizzes, right? Short quizzes and also tasks to make sure that they are following my classes and doing the work involved? Now, to be honest, right, my answer is yes, I do use in-class and also end-of-class tasks and quizzes, all right, to ensure that my students are really following my sessions. So earlier on, I mentioned Seesaw. So in each class session, I would set a small task which my students have to complete during the session, and then they have to submit it to Seesaw. And then I can easily see and check who has done the work and who hasn't. And my students will also know that I can easily check their responses, their answers. And I also use short quizzes in each session. So for example, towards the end of each session, I will ask my students to respond, to answer what I call an exit ticket quiz. And my students don't seem to mind, all right? They won't think that, well, I'm not trusting them. They don't mind. And in fact, I think they welcome the idea because they can then show me that they are being accountable to their own learning. So I myself do use short quizzes in my remote lessons, even though my students are teachers. So to recap, these are 8 of my tried and tested remote teaching strategies, using polling to warm up the class and collect students' ideas at the beginning of a session, showing students work from previous classes, enabling students to share their work with each other, using, for example, Padlets, and using occasional competitions to liven up the classroom atmosphere, and then showing the learning progress visually using apps like Satori, all right, and Loops Education, and then inserting short learning paths into each long session in order to keep students engaged, and then using teacher-paced interactive lesson units during a session, and lastly using short in-class and end-of-class tasks and quizzes. Now, so at this point you can see that yes, there are a number of strategies that we can apply, but of course if we're going to make an online lesson very engaging, very interactive. So from this page, from this slide, you can see that preparing for online teaching actually takes up a lot more time. So I hope that other people in education, school administrators, and so on will know that online teaching is, well, in a way, requires much more time for preparation. So my remote teaching then continued from February until mid-October, and I gained more and more experience in remote teaching, in engaging my students. And then in October, I received an email from the university saying that we could resume, we could go back to face-to-face teaching soon. And so on October the 29th, I experienced face-to-face teaching again. And for this group of SET students, before the 29th of October, I had met them for 7 times online. And then when I met them for the first time on October the 25th, October the 29th, all right, I was delighted, I was thrilled, and I was so happy that finally I could meet my students face to face. But nevertheless, when I think back to the last 8 months of experience in remote teaching, I realized that there are still certain things about remote teaching which might inspire our face-to-face teaching in the future. So in other words, are there things about remote teaching that can inspire face-to-face teaching? My answer is yes. For example, in traditional face-to-face lessons, students walk into the classroom and then they walk around to look for a seat, and then when they're seated they might chat up each other, and as for me, the teacher, I might need 10 minutes to warm them up, to engage them and so on and so on, all right? And then halfway into a long session, my students might start daydreaming. But with online teaching, at the beginning of a session, my students are seated in front of the computer already. And their mindset is, okay, they are there to learn. I'm about to learn. So my experience in remote teaching is that I can go into the heart of the matter of the lesson, the heart of the matter of the session, much earlier than I can in a face-to-face class. Now, this is something for us to think about. Another advantage, so to speak, of remote teaching is that it's so easy for me to get hold of guest speakers. So this is one example. So I invited a former student, Miss Sammy Chen, in this particular example, right, to do a guest sharing with one group of my students. So with remote teaching, this kind of guest sharing is very easy to organize, but not in traditional face-to-face classroom. Now finally, if I have the choice, between online teaching and face-to-face teaching, I would definitely go for face-to-face teaching because of this sense of togetherness. Nevertheless, when I think back to my last 10 months of experience in remote teaching, I realized that there are features, advantages of remote teaching that if we apply these features, these advantages of remote teaching in our face-to-face teaching, then we can also be enriching and improving the effectiveness of our face-to-face sessions. And finally, right, I mentioned a few apps during my presentation in the last 20 minutes. I'm now going to take a few minutes to show you how they work.